the situation right now is admittedly pretty bad diplomatically. While it's not, we would say, a lost cause, as in there's no ways that this could be navigated into something positive, but the signs that are being shown and the interests of the people, or the admitted interests of the people at the table, are leading me to believe that there's even a likelihood that Ukraine might not even be welcome at the negotiating table when this deal is being made. And we're going to talk about the specific language in this, which is implying that to me, and Trump's record about why that might be the case, and how that is an extremely concerning factor for the possibility of actually having peace, and why I think that, if true, that would make another outbreak of war between the Ukrainians and the Russians highly likely. And then it would just be moving the question more to a when, not an if. Anyway, let's read what Donald Trump put out, which is sending me into a tizzy, sending a bunch of people into a tizzy, and sending the whole news media on storm right now. This is from Donald J. Trump. I just had a lengthy and highly productive phone call with President Vladimir Putin of Russia. We discussed Ukraine, the Middle East, energy, artificial intelligence, and the power of the dollar, and various other subjects. We both reflected on the great history. Why is great history? I never understand his interaction with capitalization of our nations, and the fact that we fought so successfully together in World War II, remembering that Russia lost tens of millions of people, and we, likewise, lost so many. We each talk about the strengths of our respective nations and the great benefit that we will sometimes have in working together. By the way, I know this is probably just the case, because when people talk about Russia, they talk about the Soviet Union as if they're the same thing, even though the Soviet Union was made of many different republics, including Ukraine. And when people talk about the tens of millions of Russians that sacrificed for World War II, and we must acknowledge that. We must acknowledge that when negotiating with them around the Ukraine. I mean, they sacrificed so much, this common history. I'm sorry, I think it's a crock of shit. I'm actually insulted by the notion. The reason I'm insulted by the notion is you do not take the great-grandchildren of the people who bled against Nazism and then send them to occupy the great-grandchildren of the other people, the Ukrainians, who sacrificed millions to fight against Nazism, and then put their great-grandchildren in mass graves and prisons for political disobedience, destroy the civil society, burn books of Ukrainian native language, destroy the names that have any Ukrainian attachment to them, replace the homes of those who have fled with settlers. Okay, look, I don't want to get into Lebensraum things right now, but look, the point is, the general point here is, I don't 100% agree with Donald Trump dragging this out. And not only do I not 100% agree with it, I negative agree with it. Because every time I see this brought out, it's not this idea of like, because of this legacy, we need to understand that these types of territorial conquests are wrong or something. It's always like, oh, they bled with us, therefore we need to be like sympathetic to them. So did the Ukrainians. So did the Georgians when the Russians invaded Georgia. So did the Chechens when the Russians invaded Chechnya twice. And guess what? So did many people in what was Moldova when they did the first border conflict in Transnistria in the early 90s. Like, this applies to basically everyone in that area of the world that large-scale portions of the population fought and crusaded in large part against Nazism. So every time I see this brought up in reference to this war, I think it's a crock of shit. I think it is mostly just pampering the egos of the Russians. And that's what I think this is. And the more you read of this, and the more he talks about the Russians, that's the more implication I get, just as the president of the United States, just, cleaning the sweat off their brow as they invade our ally. Continuing. We each talked about the strengths of our respective nations and the great benefit that we will someday have in working together. But first, as we both agreed, we want to stop the millions of deaths taking place in the war with Russia/Ukraine. I don't know where these numbers, again, I've always said this about Trump, millions of deaths. Where is he getting these numbers? Because the most likely death number I've seen for the Ukrainians that I thought was credible, I guess this is very rough, it was something like 180,000. deaths on the Ukrainian side. On the Russian side, something like 300 to 400,000, right? They're the ones doing most of the attacking, a lot of their tactics, even though the Ukrainians have been guilty of many of those same, let's just say, disregarding of the individual Soviet tactics. And that's not even the Soviet tactics. It's like butchered versions of the Soviet tactics. But the Russians have done it on a larger scale, trying to use their manpower advantage to crush them into dust, leading to hundreds of thousands of deaths. And let's say like 200,000 civilians died on top of that, right? Or 300,000. You're still like getting close to like 1 million deaths. There's no millions and millions and millions of I don't know why he just throws numbers out there just randomly. Maybe he meant the casualties, but considering how often he lies, I don't know if he was trying to even attempt to put any attention to detail. I'm sorry I get caught up on this so much. He just does it so often. I don't see him ever reference the numbers and say a number that is plausible. It's always stuff like this, which is really disconcerting, because like I want to look to the president and be able to get some reflection of how the war actually looks. Just like I would want the president to get like intelligence briefings that gives him an idea of what the war actually looks like. But Tulsi Gabbard just got confirmed today, so good luck. President Putin even used my very strong campaign motto of common sense. We both believe very strongly in it. Why would you be proud of that? If I found out that someone like Putin used my campaign logo, I'd have to reassess exactly what it is I believe, who I am as a person, if the same stuff that gets Putin's base riled up gets my base riled up. Okay, that's the first thing I'll put out there. The second thing I'll put out there, when was his campaign motto common sense? Does anybody remember that? Does anybody remember Trump saying, common sense, that's what we're crusading for, everyone, common sense, or like common sense for America on like t-shirts or something? Like, I'll even settle for that. I'll even settle for like common sense American values, you know? Okay, that appeals to something. That appeals to a bygone era of America. Like, I can see how that kind of fits within Trump branding. But when the hell was when was common sense his campaign logo? I mean, his campaign slogan. It'd be one thing to say it was something he said on the trail, is that people should have common sense, but that's not a campaign slogan or campaign motto. It's just a common. It's a type of thing. Like, oh, you have or you don't have common sense. It'd be like if Trump said he adopted my phrase "street smarts" in reference to what those out in the neighborhood know about the. No, he didn't come up with that. You just used it in a speech. Whatever. I'm sorry. I'm getting caught up on the stupid stuff. But I mean, it's always like this. Let me try to get through the rest of this really quickly. We both believe very strongly in it. We agreed to work together very closely, including visiting each other's nations. An American has not been to Russia. I mean, American president has not been to Russia in quite a bit, so that would be a big move. We have also, I mean, like, let me put it this way. When Trump did these moves in order to get into North Korea, he had to stop military drills in order to like show an olive branch. He had to give concessions in order to do that, and it helped him with a propaganda coup. And so going to visit Russia as the president of the United States, I mean, it could really give them a lot to normalize the nation state engaged in the largest conquests of territory in the world right now, including the largest war in Europe since World War II. So, I mean, it is true, like meeting together, it's like the lowest form of concession, but it is still a concession. And I'm noting it because we're gonna start racking these up very quickly. We have also agreed to have our respective teams start, this is important, start negotiating immediately. And we will begin by calling President Zelensky of Ukraine to inform him of the conversation, something which I will be doing right now. I have asked Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Director of the CIA John Ratcliffe, National Security Advisor Michael Waltz, the Ambassador and Special Envoy Steve Witkoff to lead the negotiations, which I feel strongly will be successful. Millions of people have died in a war that should not have happened if I were president. No, non-falsifiable, but whatever. But it did happen, so it must end. No more lives should be lost. I want to thank President Putin for his time and effort with respect to the call and the release yesterday of Mark Fogel, a wonderful man that I personally greeted last night at the White House. I believe this effort will lead to a successful conclusion, hopefully soon. Mark Fogel we'll talk about at the end, because this is a separate thing. It has to do with a basically a hostage trade that we did with the Russians, and we'll get into that in a bit. But let's go back here a little bit. Let's back up to what we're talking about here when it comes to talking to the Ukrainians after Putin and Trump had the phone call. Now, it's one thing if Putin and Trump had a phone call and then Trump called Zelensky and said, hey, I think we're going to start negotiations as a group. But the way it was phrased seemed to explicitly, not explicitly, the word explicitly is not to be used, but seemed to not really like grandfather in or include Zelensky directly in the negotiations. It seemed to be Trump and Putin started talking. They had a conversation. They, went back and forth about some stuff. Trump then came back to Zelensky, informed him about it, that they're starting negotiations. But nowhere in here is it Trump and Putin and Zelensky will visit each other's countries, or Trump and Putin and Zelensky will sit down and have a conversation. Everything is emphasized about Trump and Putin having a conversation. Trump and Putin visiting each other's countries. America and Russia having this common glorious history and crusade against Nazism, and Trump and Putin's similarities on the campaign motto, because, well, not even similarities, saying it's literally the same, common sense. So none of this seems to, it is all about like his staff, and his, like CIA director, etc. So it all seems to be around Putin and Trump sitting in a tree, KSSING,
morally corrupt.
But I don't see anything in here that is explicitly including the Ukrainians, and everything seems to include the Ukrainians after the fact. Now, maybe that'll change moving forward. Maybe the Ukrainians will be at the table when these conversations are happening, when Putin's in the room, to make sure that they're at the table. But the fact that they don't say so leaves me very worried. And it leaves me worried because of two things. Number one, if the Ukrainians were not at the table, the message that would be sent is that the Americans could negotiate Ukrainian interests on their behalf. And the message that would be accepted by the Russians, broadly speaking, or at least amongst their, intelligentsia that's aligned with the political establishment, as well as those in power, will be that America is negotiating based upon its proxy state in Kiev. And so it can negotiate away this land, it can negotiate away NATO membership, it can negotiate weapons, it can negotiate away whatever. It can negotiate away basically everything in the world, because ultimately America is the one that is backing Ukraine. Without America, Ukraine does not exist. Therefore, America is the one making decisions on their behalf. And so certain details about maybe kidnapped kids, or say, possibly the complete all-for-all trading of POWs, or whatever it is, maybe that will not be as included or given as much attention in detail because the Ukrainians aren't there. And because there is not a message sent to the Russians of, hey, the Ukrainians are a nation state. And this is the key thing. The message has to be sent to the Russians. The Ukrainians are a nation state. They're a nation. They're their own people. They have their own language. They have their own culture. They have their own history. You can call it artificial, okay? But all nation states that have evolved with some amount of artificiality of the state, okay? If you're going to tell me Belgium is an original creation based upon the natural roots of the Belgian people, it's not. It's not. Certainly, linguistic ties and, history. There's a bunch of things that come to creating a modern state. But the Ukrainians have a right to exist as much as any other nation state. And they have fought for it, and they have died for it, they've bled for it, they've suffered for it, and they negotiated it. And they gave up atomic weapons. They gave up the power of the sun for it, and for the promise of safety and security and peace. So if you just take all of this sovereignty of the Ukrainian state and you rip it up, it's not a question of really, Russia versus Ukraine and its allies. It's really a question of Russia versus America and its goons in Kiev. And if that's the case, once America gets distracted in Taiwan, once America gets distracted in the Middle East with our Riviera of the Levant, plan of Trump, if, if this is actually happening. Or he gets distracted with an invasion of Panama, or some gigantic operation against the cartels, and our resources and our attention are dragged away. Then the Russians invade again in 5-6 years. Then what? What has been achieved? What have we gotten? What have we got? So this is why the Ukrainians have to be there, because their interest is survival. Their immediate interest is survival of the state. That is their first, primary, secondary, and third interest before anything else, is the survival of the Ukrainian idea. That's not Trump's primary interest. I really do not think. And I don't think it because he has explicitly said that this is not the case. When he talks about the future of Ukraine, he said, maybe it will be Russia, maybe it won't be Russia. For him, that is something to be negotiated. Maybe it'll go one way, maybe it'll go the other way. You know, what happens, what happens. Maybe it will be Russia, maybe it won't be Russia. That's what he explicitly stated not too long ago. He also said that his only interest when it comes to this war is trying to stop the bloodshed. That's really to stop the millions of people being killed. Again, not correct statistics, but the millions of people being killed, meaning territorial sovereignty, the existence of the Ukrainian state, the civil liberties of those people, American credibility, all this. The primary goal, at least being announced publicly by the United States, at least by Donald Trump, the president of the United States, is just to stop the people being killed. If that is your only goal going into a war, then your pockets are going to be snatched every time. If every time America faces down a geopolitical opponent, we just say, we don't want anybody to die, then every time they're going to say, okay, well, we'll invade you unless you give us this. Okay, well, then we'll give you this. Because, look, this is really bare basic stuff. You know, the idea of deterrence and what deterrence means and valuing things outside of human life. Like, this comes with some amount of ideology or belief in Americanism. Like, for example, protecting of the civil liberties or independent institutions or democracy or, you know, freedom of expression or, you know, sovereignty of the state, sovereignty of the individual. I don't know, we get a little libertarian. But no, that's not what's important to him. It's just the millions of people being killed. And I'm not saying that that's not important. It's just, if that's his only priority, then all those other things we talked about are not that important. All those other things we talked about can take a back seat, can be put aside. And if those things can be put aside, then what are you left with? Okay, so the first problem is the Russians will not psychologically process as a people, as a nation, that the Ukrainians are another nation state that they have to negotiate with. They're not going to register that. They're not going to process the consequences of this war. And so that is something that really concerns me about, you know, the Ukrainians not being included at the table. If they're not at the table, then they can't advocate on their own interests. And if they can't advocate on their own interests, then it's up to Donald Trump to do so. And when I don't think that's his priority, then who's going to be at the table with the primary interest of making sure the Ukrainian idea survives and that the Ukrainian people can live with the most just outcome possible? Because it's only with the foundation of justice that you're going to be able to get peace, and unless you just want a pressure cooker that's waiting to pop. And then you're just kicking the can of violence down the road, just patting yourself on the back temporarily for short-term political benefit with no benefit to the people who actually, you know, dying and suffering from the war. Now, the other thing I wanted to bring up, something that really concerns me about this and why I'm really worried about this is not the first time Trump has pulled something like this. Now, obviously, the conditions are different, but when Trump negotiated with the Taliban, he negotiated with the Taliban with the Afghan National Army, which was the military force and, you know, the government behind it, head by Ashraf Ghani. They were not included at the table. They did not negotiate at the table. And what that also did, on top of not allowing them to advocate based upon their own interests, about the interests of, you know, that Afghan government surviving, but it also undermined their credibility. If America decides the future of Ukrainian territory and defense alliances and all this on its lonesome without Ukraine's say, then what authority is supposed to be given to the government in Kiev? How do the people of Ukraine view the Ukrainian government? Do they view it as stable? Do they view it as strong? Do they view the representative of them? Is it going to make it more stable? Is it going to make it less stable? Is it going to make people, you know, comply more with the government's initiatives to maintain peace, or not comply more with the government's initiatives to maintain peace? You need to make sure that you maintain the respect of the people, which is, could be helped by making sure that the outcome is somewhat just and listening to the concerns, which is, again, why you would want the Ukrainians at the negotiating table. Anyway, point is, long story short, the Ukrainians need to be at the negotiating table. And while Trump has not explicitly said they won't be, this conversation was had without them at the negotiating table. And considering Trump's record and the way that he's talking about it up to this point, them being boxed out of talks wouldn't be that surprising to me. In fact, I think we have some clips actually to look at in a moment here. Listen to this. Do you view Ukraine as an equal member of this peace process?
Do you expect Ukraine?
Say it, what?
Do you view Ukraine as an equal member of this peace process?
It's an interesting question. I think they have to make peace. Their people are being killed, and I think they have to make peace.
We will continue.
I said that was not a good war to go into, and I think they have to make peace. That's what I think.
It was not, what do you mean a good war to go into? They were invaded. Was the Civil War a good war to go into? The South rebelled. Was World War II a good war to go into? We were Pearl Harbored, okay? Was like sometimes, when the boat hits like a rock, you can't be like, oh, that was a bad rock to hit. Yeah, of course it was a bad rock to hit. Nobody wanted to hit the rock. Maybe if you better studied the current or stuff like that could have been, but it didn't. So now it's here and we have to deal with it. And we can't just wish it away or not deal with the consequences of just trying, to pretend the issues that created it aren't there. If you just patch up the hole, don't fix the foundation, then don't be surprised if the floor caves in again. If you just, find another Minsk 3 and then don't find a long-term solution, don't be surprised if in a few years we're talking about the third Russian invasion of Ukraine within a 12 to 14, 15-year time span. But this right here terrifies me. Because if they are not included in the peace process, what is being told to the Russians is the Americans control the deal making. And so once the Americans are distracted, it's not going to be the Europeans that the Ukrainians can rely upon. It's not going to be themselves that they can rely upon. If the Americans are distracted, that's when Russia can go in and follow up on it. And without NATO membership, which we're going to get into a moment, what type of deterrence ability are the Ukrainians really given? And that's when we need to go a little bit further here, because there is more to break down. Before we get into the specific concessions that were made, the really groundbreaking big concessions that were made by the defense secretary and others in the Trump admin, I do want to show a few other things. First thing, I wanted to show this clip right here about how the Russians fought for the land, and because of all the people that died, maybe they get to keep it. Listen to this.
Do you see any future in which Ukraine returns to its pre-2014 borders?
Well, I think Pete said today that that's unlikely, right? It certainly would seem to be unlikely. They took a lot of land, and they fought for that land, and they lost a lot of soldiers. But it would just seem
replacement stuff. Also, Orange Man dumb.
Thank you so much for the tier 1 sub, I guess. Thank you. Appreciate it. Sorry, I was listening to Trump.
They fought for that land, and they lost a lot of soldiers. But it would just seem to me, and I'm not making an opinion on it, but I've read a lot on it, and a lot of people think that that's unlikely.
What does the Russians losing a lot of soldiers have to do with anything? Now, there's a few ways. Jay from Kiev is a super Ukraine hawk to the point where sometimes I'm like, actually a lot like, but I mean, maybe this could be in reference to the Russians if you're trying to be good faith here. But anyway, you read how Trump's treating the Ukrainians. It's almost like the Russians, sacrifice so much. They're a great ally from the past, in the Soviet Union, ignoring, of course, Ukraine's history there. And so we need to find some deal to quickly just kind of wrap all this up. As if, we've built up the foundation to just wrap that bow on it. And so, if the Ukrainians are being kind of, a stick in the mud right now because they're unwilling to, say, concede on territorial concessions or otherwise, then let's just maybe bump along the process without them. But, I mean, this has two risks. Number one, the risk of success. The risk that they succeed and then the war starts again in 3, 4, 5 years once America's slightly distracted and the conditions on the geopolitical scene hasn't changed changed somewhat and we're somewhere else. and then the Russians invade again because we're distracted and we can't send our supplies over there, right? Or, you know, there's the threat of failure, and the threat of failure is that, you know, maybe he's able to exceed expectations first, and he's able to find a deal with the Russians, but the Ukrainians won't accept because it's too much, and then they cut off all aid, and then cut off sanctions, and so then the Russians continue to advance, and the Russians continue to attack now with unrestricted sanctions, and then the Europeans have to take up the slack that they're not able to completely, and the Ukrainians have to take like really risky measures on mobilization, and like no matter what, how you read this outcome, whether it is kicking the can down the road, a more intensification of Ukrainian struggle with less resources and less supply, none of this leads to, I believe, a satisfactory outcome. None of this, I believe, leads to a satisfactory outcome. It'd be one thing if it was like, we need to get the Ukrainians to say that taking back Crimea by force is not going to happen. And if it's ever going to happen, it's going to be through diplomacy. Just like the Russians need to acknowledge that they need to give back the rest of Kherson because of the disgusting behavior of XYZ. They'd be like, okay, and this is my big problem. The swing for concessions. I'd appreciate it. I'd appreciate it to be like, maybe we could talk about this if they talk about that. But instead, here's Trump saying, oh, taking back Crimea is unlikely. I'm sorry. Trump is supposed to be the salesman. You're telling me Trump gets realistic militarily after he starts talking about the Riviera of the Middle East, or how we're going to enter this golden age, manifest destiny this, manifest destiny that. We're going to get rid of all of our debt in 4 years. Tariffs going to get rid of all the national debt. Tariffs going to recover the economy. I'm going to lower your grocery price. All of this realism, fuck off. Right? But when it comes to making a public show for supporting our ally who bled and died for us, oh no, taking back Crimea, that's not real, that's not militarily realistic. By the way, Ukraine surviving a few weeks wasn't militarily realistic to a lot of the actual experts, let alone Donald J. Trump. Putting all that aside, whether it is realistic or not, he's the deal man. Why isn't he saying like, yeah, maybe we could give up Crimea, maybe the Ukrainians one day would agree to giving up Crimea, but you know, we can't leave Donetsk divided. We need to reunite the region. So maybe they recognize Crimea, you give back Donetsk. We need to find some settlements so families could be more. It's like, hey, look, he's concession for concession. Concession for concession. Even if Zelensky still wasn't involved in this type of talking, which I would still be heavily against, and everything I've said about them not being at the table would still apply, it could still lead to a future war. At least then I would see he's in there swinging and moving and swinging and moving. But just like he said, I just don't think he cares about anything else than the saying like, look, he's the deal maker. But he doesn't want to apply the pressure necessary to make the deal possible. See, he's offering this concession. He's offering that concession. Let's get into the concessions. And let's talk about the difference in how Trump was talking about negotiating at a separate occasion, just say 3 weeks ago. But first, the concessions. The concessions. Here is Pete Hegseth talking about 2014 Crimea, and then we're going to talk about NATO membership as well. Two concessions that are being publicly stated by the Trump administration, which, by the way, when there was any Biden people even slightly hinting at this, I was also not too happy about it. Publicly. When Trump, it's very known that Trump likes to negotiate with PR, with these kind of public displays. Listen to this.
We want, like you, a sovereign and prosperous Ukraine. But we must start by recognizing that returning to Ukraine's pre-2014 borders is an unrealistic objective. Chasing this illusionary goal will only prolong the war and cause more suffering. A durable peace for Ukraine must include robust security guarantees to ensure that the war will not begin again.
And what are those? What are those if, and he's going to say this later, he's also excluding Ukrainian NATO membership as part of any agreement? Or even, like, I didn't even hear anything about a pathway, about like maybe they'll join NATO in 2040 or something.
This must not be Minsk 3.0.
Okay, if it must not be Minsk 3.0, why are we giving all these concessions right out the bat just to see if the Russians will bite before we've gotten any concessions back? Why are we doing that? Why are we engaging in that type of diplomacy? Why are we negotiating against ourselves?
That said, the United States does not believe that NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome of a negotiated settlement. Instead, any security guarantee must be backed by capable European and non-European troops.
What's non-European? Is that American or?
If these troops are
Because if we just say like, okay, no NATO membership, don't worry, we'll give you 5,000 French soldiers. That you've done nothing. You've accomplished tremendously little. It might sound like a lot, but American troops and other European, you'd have to get a bunch of European powers to put troops in Ukraine to make it so they'd have no choice but to have to resist once the Russians invaded, meaning that the Russians would know that any pull of the trigger could lead to a large-scale war with Europe, with a population that's quite larger than them if you combine all these European powers, all these European populations. But the problem is getting those nations on board, getting enough troops involved, and the deterrence will always be stronger even if you have a small contingent of literally just a few fucking hundred U.S. Marines or troops somewhere to add to the deterrence factor. And if we ask the Ukrainians to give up their nukes and that we would help them in this crisis, and now we're asking for rare earth metals on top of that, even though that was never originally part of the deal, $500 billion worth, which Ukraine doesn't even have within its controlled borders right now. But if we're going to do that, then the least we can do is assist this with a statement of U.S. troops on the ground to add to that deterrence factor. And it would help stop the war from creeping closer to other nations that our defense is even deeper dug into, as in, spillover, as we've seen scary instances, not too scary, but scary enough, of spillover into Poland and Romania.
Deployed as peacekeepers to Ukraine at any point, they should be deployed as part of a non-NATO mission, and they should not be covered under Article 5.
They should not be covered under Article 5. So what we would do is that we put these European peacekeepers there, and then when the Russians blow them up,
Burns is an immoral,
we say, good luck,
corrupt,
France,
bankrupt man.
good luck, Poland, good luck, so-and-so, good luck. Okay, so what amount of deterrence are we actually trying to add here? Is the deterrence to stop a future invasion, to make it just more... Look, I understand if you're not going to integrate them with NATO, then you wouldn't integrate them with Article 5. But what would we do instead? Because we would need to make the deterrence strong enough, not to just make it painful to invade Ukraine or diplomatically uncomfortable. We need to make it like, God damn, if you invade Ukraine, you are going to lose much more than you even lost before, which was a lot. And not even much more. It will be a catastrophic ending.
There also must be robust international oversight of the line of contact. To be clear, as part of any security guarantee, there will not be U.S. troops deployed to Ukraine.
Okay, so there it is. No U.S. troops. American deterrence factor will not be added to Ukraine. It is completely up to the Europeans to do so. You just heard Pete Hegseth say it. So European and non-European. So it's up for other maybe American allies that we can foot the bill to go to Ukraine and put troops there. It's not up to us to put the added deterrence effect there. By the way, does any of this sound like, hey, seems like America really cares about this. Seems like they're really stalwart on negotiations. If you're opening with this, why not go in there, grind down, and eventually give this up in return for something? Why immediately say no U.S. troops there? We know how the Russians are scared of that. If the Russians are scared of it, use that fear against them. They should. Peace through strength, man. Barbara, thank you so much for the $2. Appreciate it.
To further enable effective diplomacy and drive down energy prices that fund the Russian war machine, President Trump is unleashing American energy production and encouraging other nations to do the same. Lower energy prices, coupled with more effective enforcement of energy sanctions, will help bring Russia to the table. Safeguarding European security must be an imperative for European members of NATO. As part of this, Europe must provide the overwhelming share of future lethal and non-lethal aid to Ukraine. Members of this contact group must meet the moment. This means donating more ammunition and equipment, leveraging comparative advantages, expanding your defense industrial base, and importantly, leveling with your citizens about the threat facing Europe. Part of this is speaking frankly with your people about how this threat can only be met by spending more on defense. 2% is not enough. President Trump has called for 5%, and I agree.
If there was some sort of concession or some sort of progress, anything, then I would find some way to like have this twinkle in my eye to give me a sparkle of hope that maybe something productive could come out of this. And I'm not saying that it's impossible. I'm just saying I don't got no twinkle. I don't have no twinkle. Because if you're coming out and you're giving up NATO membership and you're giving up Ukrainian territory, both either Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, I mean, we haven't even talked about Kherson and Zaporizhia. I assume that's what the Russians are going to be demanding next. It's like, well, okay, if you give me this, well, then let's talk about the future of Mariupol. Let's talk about the future of this. And this is what happens when you give it up. Then the line moves. The line will move. And where has the line moved on the other side? What have the Russians give up? What have they given up? We just saw the Russians, and we haven't covered this on the stream yet, but the Russians just used a North Korean missile in Kiev, which, I mean, like half the city must have heard it. Shook buildings, killed people, just damaged residential homes. They do it all the time. They bombed hospitals, they bombed churches. They haven't slowed down in any of these behaviors. In fact, in some instances, I've even believed the statistics have gone up for certain types of attack. The drone attacks are continuing, the caliber missile attacks are continuing, the experimental missile attacks are continuing, the North Korean missile attacks are continuing, the glide bomb attacks, airstrikes, just mortar fire across. Nothing has changed or stopped. The ever escalating execution of Ukrainian POWs as documented by the United Nations. The human safari. Could we not be like, how about if we promise no NATO membership, you just stop hunting Ukrainian babushkas in Kherson? No, that's too much. That's too much. Now look, maybe there's something in private that I don't know. Maybe there was something conceded, but Putin, being as Putin is, so image focused, Trump is of course as well, he doesn't want the public to know that he made some sort of concession. But I mean, I could have said the same thing once the drills started with the stopped with the South Koreans in response to demands from Kim Jong-un that we got nothing in return for. Like I could say this at any point where somebody's, given up the house. I was like, oh, well, maybe. Oh, well, I mean, like, even the scenario where you're going to be like a dime richer but a dollar poorer, where it's like, oh, okay, we're going to give up NATO membership and you just give us, this tiny concession. We got nothing. We heard nothing. And we don't even know if the Ukrainians are going to be at the table. This right here is what I've been warning about for the entirety of the last year and a half. Trump excluding the Ukrainians and then making the deal on his own because the specifics of justice or long-term sustainability for the people who live there, what the locals want, keeping up American credibility, keeping our word, reinforcing our contribution and our commitment to nuclear non-proliferation through the maintenance of the Budapest Memorandum, just upkeep of the Budapest Memorandum, supporting our allies, the upkeep of deterrence in Europe, where, our second largest trading partner. Nope. And now we're living in it. We're living with this world. Everything is not like the ship isn't necessarily sunk, but I see the hole. And the situation right now could be much better with, say, I don't know, a rock with googly eyes advised by any number of suits on the Hill, rather than this man who decides, for whatever number of reasons, whether ego-based, whether trying to be friendly to Putin, or he thinks this genuinely is going to help his negotiation, has to die in the arms of Vladimir Putin verbally over and over again for the next few months, as we're seeing right here in this post. So get ready for more of that. By the way, remember, this was Trump 3 weeks ago. We have yet to hear any announcements right after he got inaugurated about what we need to do to bring the Russians to the table. More sanctions, more sanctions. Where is this? Where is this?
You've called for a ceasefire in Ukraine. If Vladimir Putin doesn't come to the table to negotiate with you, will you put additional sanctions on Russia?
Sounds likely.
And do you think
So instead of putting the additional sanctions on Russia, and we haven't even like started negotiations yet, but instead of doing that, we just conceded a bunch of stuff? So it seemed peace through strength? I don't know.
the war should be frozen currently along
The war
current
should have never
guidelines?
started. If you had a competent president, which you didn't, the war wouldn't have happened. The war in Ukraine would have never happened if I were president.
Are you going to keep sending weapons to Ukraine, or are you going to turn off the tap soon?
Well, we're looking at that. We're talking to Zelensky. We're going to be talking with President Putin very soon, and we'll see how it all happens. We're going to look at it very soon. One thing I do feel, the European Union should be paying a lot more than they're paying, because under Biden, I mean, we're in there for $200 billion more. Now, it affects
It's not true, but whatever.
them more than it affects us. We have an ocean in between, right? Little thing called an ocean. The European Union should equalize.
He just said the amount of aid
We're in there for
in
200.
its entirety and said that we've done that more than the Europeans. He didn't even, it's just not, that assumes that Europe has sent nothing to Ukraine when they've sent the majority of aid to Ukraine. It's just not, there's not even like a splash of truth in this area. There's a splash of the truth that the idea that the Europeans should be paying more. But when it comes to the data or any of the argumentation behind it, it's just all fucking dog shit. Excuse my French.
$1 billion more than the European Union. I mean, what are we, stupid? I guess the answer is yes, because they must think so.
Do.